Hey listeners, before we get started today, I just had a quick announcement for you. I didn't think about this at the time, but I wanted to add a potential trigger warning to the beginning of this episode, as it does deal with death and grief. Hello listeners, welcome to another special Patreon episode of Homegrown KC, a podcast dedicated to exploring Kansas City's fascinating history and sharing stories from its rich past. I'm your host Laura. Today I'm joined by a longtime friend, Elizabeth Hartzler. We went to undergrad together and she's going to talk about some research that she's done. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just go ahead and start with introduction. Tell us about yourself.
Sure. Well, she said my name is Elizabeth. I've lived in Kansas City my whole life. I'm a native. We were in undergrad together studying history, and then I went on and got my master's in public history, which is basically if you don't want to become an academician, then you do something with public history, and I wanted to work in museums. So that's now what I'm doing. I'm a museum coordinator in Kansas City, and yeah, happy to be here.
So, what drew you to history originally?
The truthful answer is I didn't know what else to do. I knew in high school I was terrible at math and science and anything related to that, but I really enjoyed history and researching on my own for my own projects and storytelling. I thought for a while about going to journalism, but something about history just drew me in, and I think I'm one of the few people that never changed their major. I declared history and I stuck with it, and I decided to work in museums because I pretty much knew I didn't want to teach, and by the end of my undergrad degree I knew that the politics of academia was not the politics I wanted to work with. I mean, everywhere has politics, but I didn't want to become a professor necessarily, and I didn't see myself going into history in high school teaching. So people would ask me, what do you want to do with that? And I say, I guess I want to work in a museum. And I've always loved museums, so that's what I went with, and I'm fortunate enough to be able to do that.
Very similar. I didn't want to teach. Everyone's like, oh, so you're going to become a teacher? And I wouldn't mind now teaching at a university, but every time they asked me that, I was like, no, I don't want to teach children.
Right.
So let's do museums. Yeah,
right.
That's cool. I can stay in the back maybe.
Absolutely, absolutely. And just the hurdles to become a professor, even though collegiate probably level is what I prefer to teach, or maybe high school, it just is not something I wanted to get myself into. So
no, I mean the PhD is terrifying enough, but then you get there and they're like, we expect you to publish regularly in order to keep your job.
I know.
Like, ugh, so much pressure.
I know. And I was like, I really love sharing how much I love history and the stories and getting people involved and letting them tell their own story and learning from it. So I decided that I would rather work with the public, that would keep me energized rather than publishing. You're right, just sitting in an office writing a lot, which seems for the majority kind of what a PhD involves. So yeah.
Is there a time period in history that you prefer?
Yes. Anything kind of after the turn of the century. So in grad school I worked with World War I, which is very early 1900s, 14 to 18 roughly, and I've worked in more modern history as well, so 40s, 50s, 80s. Anything kind of that American preferably is what I'm the most interested in, and it's also easier to find sources, which I'm all about making things easier on myself, but I also just love it. There's so much change that's happened in the past 100 years now that we're in 2020. It's incredible. So that's really what I love. You might call it modern American, or just, anything after kind of the golden age, whatever you want to say. That's what I'm interested in.
And still changing rapidly.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, but the more things change, I mean, if you look what's going on today, I feel like I'm right back
So
in
many
1918.
flashbacks,
I
yes.
feel like I'm right back there. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Well, the 1980s is interesting. What project was that?
1980s was Skywalk, what we're talking about today.
Oh. Well, look at that. What an awesome transition we have here.
I built that segue in, you know.
All right, so yeah, go ahead and give us the story of the Skywalk.
Okay. You just want me to plow right into all of it?
However you want to
However
tell
I
us the
want to do
story.
it. Okay. So, the Hyatt Skywalk Collapse, which is kind of, if you want to type something into your search engine, that's what I would suggest, is what I studied for my undergraduate degree thesis. And I looked at the tragedy, but also the memorialization of the tragedy. This is something that is deeply embedded in the memory of Kansas City, but people do not talk about a lot. If you ask anyone, 40 or over that lives in Kansas City and that has lived here for a long time, they're going to probably know someone who at least knows someone who was somehow connected. If I look back and you hear the people that are talking that were there that night in 1981 when this tragedy happened, they say everyone knew someone who was affected by this because it was so widespread. So I'll dig into what happened.
Let me pause you real quick. So you said that they just don't talk about it. Is there a reason for this? What do you think?
I think there is a reason for it. I think, like any tragedy, it's very painful. And I think it's difficult because there was no malicious intent. It was a terrible accident. There are things that were not done correctly, engineering-wise, that caused this collapse to happen and subsequently for so many people to be killed. But it's a lot easier to write a narrative that is comforting, I guess, when there's an equal good guy, bad guy. There's someone to blame and that person is not a good person. And in this case, there's nothing like that. Everyone had good intent. It just was a terrible tragedy, a calamity. It was an accident. And I think that makes writing a narrative that is able to kind of put the memory of that event to rest much more difficult. And it's just something that was so traumatic when I actually get into what happened, and that makes it all the more difficult. Also, some corporate negligence, which I can talk about eventually. It's all to come. Don't worry.
Okay. That makes sense. All right, so continue.
Yeah. Okay. So, 1981 summer. It is July 17th. We have just passed the 39th anniversary as of yesterday when we're recording this, and it, much like today, is a very hot summer day. And we are downtown, on just the outskirts of downtown, close to Union Station, the Liberty Memorial. In the 80s, the downtown area had hit a decline economically and socially, culturally, and the Hallmark Corporation, who has their corporate offices very close, decided to pour a lot of money and resources back into that area to try and bring tourism back to kind of the heart of Kansas City right there, because a lot of people had fled to the suburbs, and that area of town was not getting good press, and it was keeping a lot of people and commerce away. So they said, we're going to make this a place to visit, to be. And they created Crown Center. And Crown Center, as we know now, like it was then, shopping, eating, just a nice place to spend an afternoon, a weekend. And they built a massive hotel as well. And so this kind of became the new hub. It became the new hot place to be in Kansas City. It took them about a year to build this hotel, which was run and operated by Hyatt Regency. And it became over kind of that year. It opened in 1980. By 1981, it was well established, and they would hold things that would bring in a lot of locals, not just tourists from outside that were coming in, but they wanted to draw local people back. And so they started holding what is called tea dances. Basically, every Friday night, starting in May of 1981, people would come to the Hyatt Regency, and you could enter into a dance competition. That was the big thing. They had their own band. It was, I believe, Steve Miller and the Hyatt Regency quartet, and there was a large gathering space right inside the hotel where they would hold these events. So the building was very much built in the style of the 1980s. I'm laughing because I'm thinking back to how someone described the style of the 1980s, saying everything was tan and brown, which they're not wrong, it was. But they were trying to go for a very modern feel, very open aesthetic. And so when you walked into this massive atrium. It was 4 stories tall, and there was, against the front wall, it was basically all glass. And they wanted it to have a very open concept feel, so you could go in, you could walk around in this massive area. It's very light. There were skylights, and on the back wall there was, on the second floor, what was called, I believe, the mezzanine restaurant. And then where you came into the building were skywalks, which is, to picture it like a bridge. It's a suspended bridge, and they would cross this massive atrium area from, I believe, the tower, which was 40 stories, which is where all of the hotel rooms were. They would cross the atrium then and connect to kind of the conference area. So you could go up to all these levels, 1 through 4, and you could cross these bridges or skywalks and kind of have a bird's eye view of what was happening in the atrium.
So how many skywalks were there?
So against the front wall, there were 2 skywalks that were stacked one over the other. One was on the 2nd floor, and then one was on the 4th floor.
Okay.
And they were directly over each other, very close to the entrance, close to that outer wall. Mm-hmm. And then as you moved further in, there was a 3rd skywalk that connected the 3rd floors. So you could go up kind of either end of this and then walk across these skywalks that transverse these massive open atrium area. And there was lounge seating, and there was all these different types of things, but it's a massive area. Mm-hmm. And these skywalks, they were made to be, the reason they call them skywalks is because they wanted them to look like they were floating. So they wanted any supporting to be very minimal, to be almost so your eye didn't see it. So it looked like you were just kind of suspended in the sky. You were walking across the sky. So these are not substantial looking, massive concrete pillared things. They're kind of just a bridge that is supported via, not a cable, but like a metal rod from the ceiling is how that they're supported. And we can get into a little bit of that later when we see what actually happens. But there are 3. The 2 that are suspended, one over the other, the one on the 4th floor and the 2nd floor, are the ones that will have the structural failure. So those are the really ones that we're interested in. So on this evening in July, the tea dance starts at about 5 o'clock, which is when they all started up. And there would be plenty of bars you can meander to, lots of seating, a dance floor, which is in the front of the building and under the 2 skywalks, well, the 3 skywalks, but specifically the 2 that are one on top of the other. These were massively, massively popular events, and about 1,600 people were in attendance that night. And if you look at footage from the evening, because there was a local, I think KNBC was there, Michael Mahoney, who's still a reporter, was there that night with his cameraman. And they took a lot of footage just being, reporting on kind of a fun event that was happening in Kansas City.
Yeah.
And it is packed. It is packed. There is just, it's not standing room only, but there are tons of people in this area. And the dance competition, which I believe there's a prize, I'm not sure if it was a cash prize or what it was, is going to be starting at 7 o'clock. The event starts at 5. It's going to start at 7 o'clock.
I'm also kind of interested.
Yeah.
Do you know what kind of dance we're doing? Are we talking like...
We're doing swing dance.
Nice.
So this actually brought younger people, but it brought my grandparents. So it was people that grew up with big band and loved big band music. So if you look at the kind of people that are there, it's mostly people that are 40 and over, I would guess. It's parents at that time in the 80s, you know. And
this is funny, actually.
Yeah.
Just yesterday, I was listening to another podcast.
Yeah.
Who was covering a swing dancer from the early 1900s, and then they mentioned, you know, swing had a resurgence in popularity in the 1980s. It
absolutely did. So they were, it was a big band swing dancing competition. So this had just kicked off. People had numbers on their back, the people that were in the competition, and they were all on the dance floor, and it was a big spectator draw, so all the other people had drawn close to the dance floor and were up on these skywalks so they could look down on the dancing that was happening. The song that was playing was Satin Doll by Glenn Miller, I believe, and at 7:05 is when the collapse happened. And what actually took place is the 4th floor skywalk started to give way, and people said, who were there that night, they said that they heard a metallic popping sound, and then the 4th floor...
Those would be the cables, I'm assuming.
Those would be the it's kind of like the bolt. It's the structure that holds the cables together.
Yeah.
That's really supporting the load. It's not necessarily in the ceiling. It's the actual mechanism that's keeping these skywalks together. The 4th floor one drops a little bit and then collapses down onto the 2nd floor one, which then collapses onto the dance floor. And it happens incredibly quickly, and people don't really know what is going on. You know, I've studied, since I studied memorialization of these mass tragedies for a long time, it's all kind of the same. Your brain doesn't know what to do. Like there's no way to categorize what is actually happening in that moment. And so you kind of are in shock. And there was a quote, and it says, "For half a second there was silence," Bridget Cleary, a 23-year-old nurse, later told Newsweek. She heard the tinkling of broken glass and the stream of water from the broken pipes. A soft white dust filled the air. She said the music stopped, then everyone started screaming. And that, from the best that I can tell, is really what happened. When these things crushed down, they were, each of these was about 32 tons, I think, that came falling down one on top of the other down onto the dance floor. And so even though they were meant to look light, they were not. They were massive structures. And once people realized what had happened, it was chaos. It was panic. Some people started to flee from the scene. Other people were looking for their loved ones who just a moment before had been standing next to them and now was trapped under these structures that had collapsed. And the process begins, and people are calling into emergency services one after the other, and it gets coded as a structural collapse, which is correct, it was. And so emergency services started showing up from everywhere in Kansas City. It's because they know that this is going to be a massive undertaking, and it is the 14-hour rescue mission. And
14 hours sounds short.
It does because people really pulled together. I think that that's a big part of why it didn't take a terribly long time. Also because
the massive number of people helping out.
The massive number of people that were helping out, and it wasn't that the whole building came down. You know, while it is a ton of debris to move and to get to, it's not like an entire building has collapsed. You know, which is a massive multi-day undertaking. Also, they know that they're working against the clock, because when this collapse happens, it severs the water feed to the sprinkler system. So not only are these people trapped under tons and tons of debris in terrible positions, but it starts flooding. And so the people on the very bottom who are on the dance floor are starting to drown, as well as being crushed by this ton. And so they eventually get that water turned off. They're worried about the electricity mixing with the water and that being very hazardous. But also, you have to move as fast as possible in any circumstance like this, because the quicker you can get to these people, the better chance they have of surviving, or of coming out in a better condition. And so that's what they do. There's a doctor, and I forget which hospital he was working out of, but he took over the triage of the cases. His name was Dr. Joe Wackerly, and he is on call in an emergency room and runs over, and you'll see him all throughout the footage. He's the one that's telling people where to go, what to do. The first thing they try and do is get everyone out of the building and onto the front driveway area, which is where the triage center kind of is. And within a few hours, they have everyone that they are able to easily pull out of the building and to hospitals as is needed. Around 200, over 200 people are injured in this. 114 people die as a result of it.
Still terribly tragic, but
yeah.
Considering how many people were there and the state of the collapse, it sounds like most of the people did all right.
Yeah.
Physically.
Right. Right. Yes. I mean, a lot of people were able to, with help, be escorted out, or people were able to walk out as was needed. Some people, of course, were carried. But yes, I mean, if you think about, there's almost 2,000 people there that night, and you know, there's like I said, 114 people killed. It is still, however, and I'm trying to find in my notes so I get this exactly right, it is the most deadly engineering kind of collapse, or the most deadly collapse of a building before 9/11 happens, before the collapse of the World Trade Center.
Actually, while you were describing it, that's what I was thinking of. My memories of 9/11.
Right. So you don't see anything like this until Oklahoma City bombing, which is massive, and it's very similar, but the death toll is, you know, it's similar, but this is, I believe there are more in this one, don't quote me on that, but if you want to compare it to something, it's easier to compare it to like the Oklahoma City bombing than it is to 9/11, which was a massive catastrophe, the likes that we've never seen, you know.
I didn't mean it to sound flippant or like, oh, it's only 100 people. I mean, it's still so terrible, but I'm glad to hear that it wasn't a higher number.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it's, you know, when you look at what actually happened and what caused this, it was kind of a ticking time bomb, the way that it was built, and the fact that really when the skywalks collapsed, I believe on the second floor one, there were around 30 people, and there were fewer on the fourth floor one. But the problem was the fact that the dance floor was right under it, you know. So like I said, it takes 14 hours for them to get everything moved enough that they can get everyone out that they can, and to discover all of the people who have deceased in the process. You know, there really wasn't a team that was prepared to do this kind of sort of rescue operation. The closest that we had at the time was a team that was prepared to help in rescuing of natural disasters. But this is so very different. A backhoe is not what you need. You need sledgehammers and jackhammers and cranes eventually is what happens. They're trying to move this debris and they're trying to use forklifts or backhoes or whatever it is, and it's not moving this stuff because it is so heavy. And so eventually, all the people that are on the scene, the majority of who are either rescue, so firemen, police, EMT, and construction. It's a ton of construction workers that they call in to help them out. And then eventually they call in a crane service, Belger, Cartage, and Crane, who is a well-known Kansas City crane company. And they actually bring in a very large crane, not as big as you see at massive construction sites to build skyscrapers, but 3 very crane cranes. And they actually break through the front wall of glass.
I was going to ask, how did they get in there?
So they did bring in the backhoes, and they actually used the backhoes to tear out the front of the building, so that they could get in and out very easily. But they made the call. The easiest and the fastest thing to do was to just have the cranes break through the front windows because it's all glass.
Was there concern about the rest of the building coming down while they're working on this?
I imagine there would have been. I know that certainly the people that were there that night were very afraid of this. And also, I think there was fear because while they were building this building, about 2,700 square feet of the roof collapsed at one point.
Oh, wow.
And this is something that you weirdly see, kind of a weird amount happening in building in the 80s, is that there are a lot of structural problems. I don't really know what the cause of that is, and maybe it is time, and they're working very fast. I don't know. I think that's partially what happened. The architects that drew up the plans, the way that they had designed the fastening and the load to be spread out for these skywalks should have kind of stretched that load more evenly. So the load of the second floor skywalk would be more from the roof than it was actually just from the 4th floor skywalk. So that was a big problem. And once again, I'm not a structural engineer, and I'd have to draw diagrams to try and actually explain how it worked. But the coupling mechanism was changed by the contractor, I believe, while they were building it. And there was not a good review process in place for that. And so it really put double the load on the 4th floor, which is, I think, kind of what happened. When you look at the actual metal, it's terribly mangled, and you can tell the stress was immense on these pieces of hardware. So that, like I said, takes about 14 hours. Horrifically, at the end, they get the final kind of skywalk off the floor, and they find kind of a pocket of about 30 people who have deceased, and it's kind of like any search and rescue recovery project. They will work very hard for a long time. Then there's a call for silence, so they can try and hear people that are calling for help, and then they will resume and they try and find more people, and they just slowly work down. And of course, the hazard always in something like this is that while you're trying to get someone and you're trying to move this debris, it's going to shift in a way that you don't want it to, and it ends up hurting more people. And that was what they were really afraid of, because the second floor skywalk, it kind of split right in the middle and bowed down so that it just went kind of crack right in the middle. And it was so that both ends that were attached to the second floor were still attached to the second floor. Oh, wow. And so they were worried that outer portion of the skywalk was going to collapse down still or further. So yeah, they were afraid of more collapse. Definitely the people that were there were afraid of more collapse of the building. And I can talk about that a little bit personally. So my grandparents were there that night. That's my personal connection to this. My mother was away on a skiing trip. She was in college, and they had decided to go check out the sea dance because it sounded amazing. And so they were, as far as I can tell, I believe that they were on that mezzanine restaurant area, which was facing, looking out at these skywalks, the three of them, and it was facing the dance floor. And so I think they had taken the escalator up there and were kind of had that bird's eye view, probably got a drink and everything. And their account of it is pretty much the same as everyone else's. There was what they thought at first was smoke filling the air. It was really this very fine powdery debris. And then once that cleared enough, they could tell that it was a collapse. It was the debris from this massive collapse. And my grandfather fully believed that the building might totally collapse. You know, they didn't know what was going to happen, if there's going to be a chain reaction, if it was a one and done. And he grabbed my grandmother and found an emergency exit, and they just booked it out of there and got as far away as possible. They had parked underground. There's an underground parking facility kind of underneath this building, and they had to leave their car there because they were concerned that this was a massive structural failure that was just beginning. And so they got a taxi home and called my mom, who was, as I said, on the skiing trip. And the first thing that they said is, "We're okay." And my mom says, "Okay, why are you telling me that you're okay?"
That would be my reaction. And then the next one is, "What the hell happened?"
Yeah, exactly. Like, what happened? And they were like, "Turn on the news." It was on national news. They were reporting it. It was a national. I'm not sure if it was reported internationally, but it was a massive event. It got a lot of press
as it was happening, since there were already reporters there.
Exactly. Michael Mahoney got all this footage and then I believe booked it back and started reporting live as a first-hand witness of what had gone on. And it followed closely the entire rescue kind of process. So there's a lot of video and photographic footage of this whole thing. Later, they were able to go back and get their car, but it was something that definitely stuck with them. You know, I don't know. I never heard from them because they didn't talk about it a ton. That it really terribly impacted them. I think probably because they got out very quickly. But I know that it had terrible repercussions on people who were there, as far as, you know, loud noises affecting them very horribly, or anything that resembled a bridge or a skywalk would conjure this fear, you know.
I don't blame them. I don't know that I'd ever walk on a bridge again. Or
No, absolutely not. And it's something that I definitely think about every time I cross something. The very good thing is that there were laws put in place as far as, I believe, coding for this type of thing to try and prevent this type of structural failure from happening again. So it had a huge impact on architecture and kind of the very structural intricacies of something like these skywalks, because it was a massive ordeal.
Yeah.
And one, as I said, you know, when we were talking in the beginning about why people don't talk about it, it's one of those things, as I mentioned, it was, you know, it was criminal negligence to a degree, but I don't think anyone that had any part in this thought that it would have this outcome. You know, I totally don't believe that. But I think there was definitely corners that were cut for time and probably money. And I would say kind of the biggest misconception about this whole ordeal is that Hyatt Regency was to blame. They were not. Hyatt Regency was running this hotel. They were the corporation that staffed and ran this hotel. The actual building, though, was the Crown Center Corporation, their LLC, that kind of put up the entire Crown Center infrastructure. And so the liability was really on Hallmark.
Okay.
And they, in Kansas City and nationally, especially, back in the 80s in the heyday of greeting cards and all these type of things before you could just text someone really quick, they were a massive deal. And they still are in Kansas City.
They're still a big deal in Kansas City.
They are still a very big deal. And they still, hold a lot of that area as far as property is concerned. And so they did what they could to try. This is where we get really antsy and difficult, because Hallmark did reach a settlement. I want to say they paid out about $140 million in settlements
to the victims.
Okay. Yeah. But they were very quick to get the hotel back open and operating, which was a very sticky point for survivors.
I could see how they would be like, you shouldn't do that, and this is only leading to our thought that this was maybe on purpose in some way.
Yeah, I think it
was...
Not
on purpose so much as...
You're not putting the community first.
Yeah.
You're putting your bottom line first, to put it in maybe an acceptable way. And I think that was a feeling of a lot of the people that were survivors, is that they really tried to brush it under the rug.
Yeah.
I want to say it was less than a year before they reopened.
Oh, wow.
Like, it was a very, very fast turnaround for when they cleaned all this up. And, of course, they did not put the skywalks back. I believe they put one walkway back, but it was not suspended, it was supported by pillars, which is as it is today. If you walk in there, you're going to see one kind of large mezzanine rather than a bunch of skywalks. Mm-hmm. So I think that was difficult, because Kansas City really held Hallmark in high esteem, and they still do, but this was a tragedy that could have been prevented. And I think that people have not forgotten that, to a large extent. And the difficulty with putting something like this to rest is when you have a mass tragedy like this, and you see this all over the United States, all over the world, there's this phenomena of what they call sacred or hallowed ground. Mm-hmm. It's like a battlefield is the easiest way to explain it. A lot, it's like Gettysburg or something. It's a place where so many people have lost their lives, and there's been such tragedy, and it's difficult to even conceive of going back to anything that's normal. You want to keep that place as kind of a place of reverence, and I don't think that was ever a possibility in this situation. And I'm not saying that it should have been, but it's still just a difficult place for people who have known about or have been affected personally by this tragedy to regard as just another hotel lobby.
And do you think it's because it's a hotel? If it had been some other building, would it have been more likely to have been memorialized in some way?
I don't know. I think that's difficult. I don't think so. Because if you look at like Oklahoma City, or if you look at 9/11, business there did not go back to the way it was. It became hallowed ground. Mm-hmm. They built massive memorials, museums, places of remembrance, rather than reopening something like a corporate space or a hotel or anything of that nature. So I don't really, there was no good solution, and I think that is why I don't have a lot of animosity toward Hallmark is because there really was no good solution for this. You know, it was a brand new structure, and they had put a lot of time and resources into it. And you know, what is the alternative? You tear the whole thing down. You know, they think they really were between a rock and a hard place for this one. I believe they did put up a memorial plaque.
Okay.
In the building somewhere. I've only been there once, briefly, and did not look for it. But it's hard to go back to a place like that and to be able to just
pretend nothing happened.
Pretend nothing happened. Exactly right. Which, if you're a Kansas City native for very long, or if you were here during that time, I don't know that a person in Kansas City could have, and certainly none of the people that were there that night. I think I've read a lot of interviews of people who are survivors, and they either refuse to go back in, or they very much dislike going back. And I don't blame them.
No,
I certainly would as well. I don't think I would hang out there personally. As I said, I only went in there once, but...
Were you there for your research?
No, I was actually there for the dedication of the memorial.
Okay, cool. So talk about the memorial.
So, pardon me.
Came, like 40 years too late?
Yes, it was very late. So I'll give you a little bit of background into me. The academic research area that I focus on is memorialization in America, specifically after World War II. Really, though, after the Civil War is what I have focused on, and memorialization is difficult in the best times. But the problem is, a lot of times we're memorializing very hard subjects, very, very difficult, very personal subjects, especially in the case of mass tragedies. That's why I keep relating it to like Oklahoma City or 9/11, because there's some of the other most well-known instances of things kind of like this. Right after this is happening, and the years immediately following this, of course, there are tons of court cases and settlements, and this is making a very slow legal process. Mm-hmm. And definitely some of the victims wanted a payout to help build a memorial for it. The difficult part, though, is memorializing immediately after a tragedy like this is, personally, I would say, not advisable, because it is still so raw, and you don't know how the communal memory and feelings of this event are going to play out.
Okay.
And I think that everyone needs time to personally, come to terms with what has happened before you try and put something up literally in stone or metal. A lot of times that is going to keep this memory around. Not that memory won't change, because it does, but I think the immediate impulse, at least now in America and globally, is to immediately memorialize something. Something terrible happens, and we must build a memorial immediately. You certainly see this in Oklahoma City at 9/11. Ideas for memorials were rolling in from all over the world within 24 hours. Yeah, it was massive, absolutely massive. But people really are not in a place to make these kind of very important, especially as we're saying now, decisions on memorializing something like this. And because it is so personal, it's very difficult to come to an agreement on how to memorialize this. Mm-hmm. And as I said, the natural place to do something like that is the spot where the tragedy has happened, and that is completely out of the question in this instance. So the problem arises of, where do we put it? How does it look? How do we get the funding? All of these different things. And so yes, it did take a very long time for it to happen. And it was definitely a source of pain for a lot of the people who are survivors that it took so long to happen. But it did eventually, and it was dedicated in, I believe, November of 2015, which was a year after I graduated from undergrad. And I went to the dedication, and I parked in the parking lot of the Hyatt and got my parking validated inside.
Was that surreal for you?
Very. It was very surreal for me because it was the first time I had ever been inside. Because
so you grew up hearing about it, and were you just like, okay, well then I'm never gonna go because I've heard the story, or did you not even think about it? Just like, oh, I have no need to go.
I think I felt that I didn't have a need to go. You know, I was definitely curious about it, and I definitely considered many times going there. But to what end? You know, that, I mean, maybe to help me get a better understanding for the layout of the building, perhaps, but, you know, it was not the focus of what I was trying to get to the core of, which is really the people that were involved. You know, it's them that are the center of this narrative, the center of this memorial. And so that was never a big issue for me, as far as, it wasn't that I felt, oh, I never want to go into this place. But I would say that it definitely felt odd. It was not a comfortable feeling, you know, because I had this knowledge of what had happened and the kind of relation to it. I definitely know that my grandparents, I don't know if they ever went back. They certainly never wanted to. My parents never wanted to. Pardon. So I never thought that it would be a valuable experience necessarily.
Okay.
So the memorial that was built kind of catty corner to the Hyatt Regency. It's at 22nd and Gillum. It's actually kind of on property that you would assume is part of, I think, Children's Mercy, which is right there.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there is not good parking. There's really not any parking unless you want to park at the Hyatt or find street parking around there. But it's as close, I believe, to the site as they could get. And the easiest place for them to build, because you start getting into negotiations like with the Kansas City Parks Department and everything like that, which is fine. I believe that they oversee them now. You can look at the memorial on their website. But it's quite beautiful. It's an abstract sculpture that represents two people dancing, and it's on a pedestal that has the names of all the people who died that night on it. And there's kind of a seating area and then beautiful landscaping. And it's outdoor. It's not enclosed. It's an outdoor monument memorial type is the structure type. And it was a beautiful dedication. There were a lot of people there, and it was, for me, definitely a wonderful bookend to my journey with the Hyatt, and to a lot of course, everyone who was, I think, affected by it, and just especially the people who worked so long to make it happen. That they started in '81 and had been working tirelessly till 2015 to make the memorial come to life, to come to fruition, and they finally did. And I for one am very happy that it's there and pleased with it, and I definitely hope that they are as well. So
until it was erected in 2015, was there any kind of immaterial memorials? If my question makes sense.
Yeah, like something that has a memorial purpose, but not a massive structure like that. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes and no. Also,
Like you see a lot of temporary
I'm not
memorials.
Sure what I'm trying to ask.
A lot of times these very permanent, quote unquote, permanent memorials, that we can have a long discussion, but not today, about the subject. But a lot of these very permanent, we think to be memorials, are preceded by temporary memorials. So a very good example of this, once again, is Oklahoma City or 9/11, where people would bring offerings to the site and leave flowers, mementos, candles, anything of that nature. That's kind of a temporary memorial structure. And, you know, I don't remember that happened. I don't remember that people brought things to the Hyatt. They may have. I just haven't run across that in the things that I have looked at. And I know for a long time, of course, it was closed for investigation and, you know, the removal of all of the people that had died, because they actually, in one of the rooms adjacent, set up a temporary morgue, actually in the building as they were going through. So it takes a very long time to get places like this put back and to allow people back in. So I'm not sure that there was a good place for people to gather or to place any type of flowers or temporary memorial type things.
Okay, yeah.
Otherwise, I'm trying to think of anything else that would have been like that. There were a ton of news articles written. There were a ton of, you know, kind of anniversary footage that would be compiled.
Okay.
There was a book compiled, which, if anyone wants to know more about this, it's, I believe, out of print now, but you can find it from a library, or you can find a few limited sources online to get the book from. It's called The Last Dance, and it's the work of a couple different, I believe, Kansas City Star reporters who covered this this tragedy, and it's very comprehensive. It walks you through the whole thing, and it was released for the 30th anniversary. And it's a beautiful coffee table book, and really tells the entire narrative. Lots of biographies of people who were there or that assisted in the recovery of people. So definitely check that out. They also had a corresponding website up for that for a long time, which I'm not sure if it's still around or not. And then the Memorial Foundation for building the memorial that is there now had a website for a very long time. I haven't checked on it in a while to see if it's still there. It was mostly to tell people what the memorial is for and kind of the progress on raising funds for it. Okay. So there haven't been any other memorial attempts I know of, apart from, I believe in Wichita, but I could be wrong about that, or in Jefferson City. I'm not sure which one.
Two very different locations.
Two very different locations, both capitals.
Wichita, not capital.
Not capital, sorry.
Major cities.
Yes, there you go, thank you. Not in Kansas City. This is what I'm trying to get at. Not here in the Kansas City metro area. There is a memorial to an all-female mariachi band who was there that night.
Wow.
And whose name I don't remember well and would butcher even if I did, so I won't attempt. But I believe all 4 of those women passed away that night.
Okay.
And there is a memorial to them that is built not in the Kansas City metro area.
Maybe in their hometown?
I believe so. And it's specifically, though, dedicated to them and their mariachi group that perished with them, you know. So that's the only other Skywalk Collapse adjacent, you might say, memorial that I know of. Okay. And that I have visited that one as well. That was many years ago now, when I was doing research. So those are the memorial attempts. Other than, as I mentioned, the plaque that I have heard is supposedly there in the building, but I have not seen for myself. So.
Okay. Well, I didn't have any other questions. Is there anything else you wanted to share with us?
I'm not sure that there is.
You told the story very well, by the way. I love the intro where you're building the scene for us. That was lovely.
I'm trying to, because there's so much that goes into the story as far as the complexities of not just the structural failure, which is enough on its own to write a lot about, but the people that were there and how it happened and all of the different forces that were involved in it. I think that there have been a lot of very positive outcomes from it, even though it was such a terrible tragedy, certainly in of course, as I said, the building codes, but just in the way that it was handled. The part about all of this that always got me choked up was watching the recovery attempt, and people just, without a thought to themselves, went immediately. They may have been on the way home. It was a Friday night, and they were tired, and they were just trying to get home to their family, but they went. They dropped everything. And they did not stop until it was done. I forget who it was. It may have been the chief of the fire department at the time, or it may have been the Mayor Berkeley, who was in position at the time. But I think they said afterward there was a ton of machinery that was brought, tools, jackhammers, all this kind of stuff that was brought and just left, or maybe that was broken and just left after all this. And I think they offered to reimburse, but no one ever showed up to collect. They didn't see it as an imposition or as something that needed reward. It was what you did. And as terrible as it is to look back on something like this, I think that is something very worth remembering.
Yeah.
Is these type of things really can bring out the best in people, when it's something like this. And I hope that for that sake, that it's talked about more and it's remembered better, or kind of with more joy than it is. Not necessarily joy, but pride. Definitely pride.
Okay, pride in your city and your community.
Yes, I think that is something that you can very much find in this story. That is probably what I would leave it with.
I guess I do have another question now.
Please.
With your grandparents and those of their age having been the people involved, the victims, and I don't know how to say this any nicer, with them dying off.
Yes, right. Yeah, the generation is slowly passing away.
Yes, thank you. That's much better.
It happens.
Is
yes.
there a risk of this story not being remembered? Or do you think it's been passed down into their families enough that...
I think it has been passed down. I think it's definitely been passed down. Certainly the people that were affected, like myself. I think that there was always a risk of it being quote unquote forgotten, and a lot of times, this is not to say that any memorial is going to help keep the narrative or the history alive. That's not the purpose, which is a part of another longer conversation.
Yes.
But the purpose of a memorial like this is not to teach a history lesson, it's to memorialize the people that died that night. And I think that the onus is on us and the teaching of our local history to make sure that people do remember.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's not in terrible concern of it being forgotten, because it was so pivotal for Kansas City. I think it's very sad and difficult to remember, like anything like this, but it left an, as they say, indelible mark on the psyche and on the spirit of Kansas City. That public feeling, that public memory that we talk about so much.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it will definitely remain, and we have a memorial now to help us do that, to help us remember those people who died and the people that sacrificed so much for it, and the people who are still here, who are still news reporters, who do still remember it, make sure that it is marked every year. I'm sure that this year there would have been something
had it not been for
a pandemic and public gatherings being strongly dissuaded. But I think that it's, as with anything like this, it's on our own impetus, and it's our own obligation to make sure that something like this isn't forgotten.
Right. All right, well, that's everything for today. Thank you for joining us. You were amazing.
Thank you for having me. I will say, do a Google search if you want to know more. Find the book. There is a fantastic 5-part, it's been broken up into 5 parts on YouTube series. It was I think it's called the Hyatt Skywalk Collapse Minute by Minute, and you can find it, and there's a ton of archival footage in there and a ton of first-hand accounts, and it is very moving if you want to know more than what I was able to tell you today.
All right, great. Yeah, check that out, folks. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed that episode. Elizabeth is a longtime friend, and history and memorialization of history is really fascinating. It's something that I'm starting to get more into, so it was great to talk to her about that subject. Make sure to visit the website homegrownkc.wordpress.com and find me on social media. I'm homegrownkc on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and Instagram. As always, thanks goes out to the Dear Misses for the use of their song Kansas City, and to my sister-in-law Sarah McCombs for the logo. And lastly, thank you to you listeners for your support.
Seem to shake this feeling, and I can't seem to get you off my mind. Thought I lost my nerve forever, and I know that it's now or never to try and see this through. Tie loose ends up with a bow and start anew. We could talk through the nights on the phone, but we toss and we turn all alone, and we both know that that's not the way we roll. City.